Okay.
I'm pushing record.
It's
All right.
recording. Dun,
Hey,
dun, dun.
everybody. Welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. We're testing out Zoom today to see how it works, so let us know what you think. I'm Pastor Megan in San Francisco at www.gracesf.com, and at Grace Lutheran we worship on Sundays at 10:30 a.m., and all are welcome. In the car dealership fixer-upper place is...
Pastor Amanda. I serve at Central Lutheran Church in Northeast Portland, Oregon. I am currently at the car repair place, so I'm going to have to run off in just a few minutes. But our website is centralportland.org. You can come and join us for worship at 10:15 on Sunday mornings. And our Holy Week coming up services, and y'all should tell when your Holy Week services are, 7 p.m. on Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday, and 3 p.m. Easter egg hunt story time for our vigil on Saturday.
And in Colorado is...
Hi there, I'm Pastor Dan Tisdell. I'm at First Lutheran of Gypsum, Colorado, along I-70 mountains. Our service is at 9 a.m. on Sunday, both Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday. And our Facebook page and web page are both all one word, First Lutheran of Gypsum. So come check us out. Our Holy Week schedule is Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter Vigil, all at 7 p.m. And we'll talk a little bit about that next week, maybe. I was going to say, no, next week. Anyway. So,
and this week is a dealer's choice pastor pick or congregation pick or liturgy committee pick. It is sometimes worshipped as both Palm and Passion Sunday. We'll explain what both of those mean. But because Pastor Amanda will have to run away soon, she's going to tell us why her congregation picked to do just Palm Sunday.
So Palm Sunday is just the portion of the Sunday where Jesus has the triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And oftentimes pastors choose to do both Palm and Passion because people don't come back for Thursday, Friday. So it's like going to the great big party and then going to the next big party, but missing the part in between where people have a hangover. And you really should know that people get a hangover in between parties, right?
Meaning the Jesus guys, is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's a lot worse than a bad hangover, right? So
hang over on a cross.
So my car's ready. So I'll be really short. But we're deciding this year to do just Palm Sunday and really, really, really strongly encourage people to come to all of Holy Week. And that's been our choice this year because we wanted to give that a try. It's the first year with this new music director. And so we really wanted to double down on our Holy Week. We'll see how it goes. So I have to go get my car.
I knew that if we started the Bible study, that's when your car would be finished.
That's exactly when it's done.
So drive safe, and we'll see you next time.
Alrighty. Bye.
And if you'd like, I can talk about the difference when we do kind of combine both. But
yeah.
At my church, we do we start off on Palm Sunday with a procession. We walk around the block, either singing a song or saying Hosanna in the highest and sort of recreating it. And I think that's twofold. It's sort of to think about what it was like to come into the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, but also, and I think more importantly, it's to annoy our neighbors, and I mean that literally. To walk around the block and say, "What the heck is going on?" Oh, it's those weird church folks. But it's a sort of subtle, fun way to sort of literally be present in the lives of our neighbors. Walk around and then they go, oh, maybe there's something special going on this week. Oh, it's Holy Week. Whatever, it's sort of a fun thing to do. And then we have a gospel, two gospels. One is sort of the story of Palm Sunday, and then what I do later on is I do the Passion Sunday, which is the whole story. And as Amanda said, that's really, we do that for the people that we don't think are probably going to be there on Thursday or Friday or Saturday, so they can sort of follow the difficult parts. I had a campus pastor, my beloved campus pastor used to say that she wanted to give little tickets to anybody who showed up to Monday, Thursday, or Good Friday, and those are the only people that could come to Easter Sunday. because otherwise you're going from celebration, like Amanda said, from celebration to celebration, and you're not the celebration means so much more if you go through those other texts, those other days, on Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday. So we read through the whole Passion, and I usually do it sort of in some kind of creative way. The last year and this year, I intentionally don't get people to ahead of time. I just hand out scripts that are pre-highlighted, and I'm going to have several microphones, and people are just going to read the different parts of the story, and I'm usually the narrator. So I hand out a bunch of scripts to volunteers. I don't make them do it, but I'll sit there and wait until I have enough people too. So and that's kind of fun because you have different people popping up around the congregation reading the story, and it literally ends with, and then I think the tomb was sealed or something like that, and that's it. Mm. So it sort of is a little like abrupt in a way, and I think that's good. It almost makes you kind of want to go, well, what comes next? Which is, of course, Easter, the Easter story. So that's what we do for. It's sort of a combine of Palm and Passion Sunday. Some people actually almost totally, I'll say, neglect the Palm part, but they do a little less of the Palm Sunday part and just have more of a Passion. But I would say most churches tend to blend the two. It kind of depends on if you have a really good turnout for those midweek services during Holy Week, then maybe you don't need to do the Passion part.
Yeah. I like just adding one little thing in there. I like them. I do all the midweek services, and I like them. But one of the fun things to know is that early Christians, when they decided to walk around the church a certain number of times on Palm Sunday and on different times when they walk around the church, has less to do with God thinking these ancient rituals were important, or Christians thinking these ancient rituals were important, but it was because pastors in rural places, and back then, like, the word for rural places was pagan, in communities where people weren't familiar with Christian rituals or Christian scripture, they did a lot of things to modify their buildings to use the signs and symbols of the people who lived in their neighborhoods to try to encourage them to come to church. So if the pastor went up the hill and said, "Why don't you come to our church?" and that person said, "I only go in buildings with 13 points on their windows because I believe the sacred can only show up if there's 13 points on their windows." And so those pastors said, "Great. Did you know our congregation has a capital campaign right now, and we're working on a brand new 13-pointed window? It's this new thing. It's called a rose window, and it celebrates Mary. Let me tell you all about Mary, the mother of Jesus." And so they used these, what some people might call superstitions, or they used the local piety as a way to encourage people to come to their church. And so they went to a certain part of the world where they said, when we do sacred rituals, we have to walk around the outside of the building 5 times, or whatever the number was for that specific place on the globe. And so the pastor in that area said, "Did you know, we don't do it every Sunday like you do, but we do it on this one very special Sunday, and you should show up for that special Sunday." And it was very intentional that they picked the Sunday that names that Jesus is the God that you should follow, and here's how to do it, and then now come to these Easter services and learn like this part of the service. And this was in a time when in the church year they celebrated the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus every week, not on a year-long moon cycle. So they would say, you should come to our special Thursday worship, because on Thursday it's Palm Sunday and we walk around the church building. We don't do it on Fridays or Saturdays or Sundays, because we're going to do what your neighbor down the other way said was the only reason they would come to church. And so that walking and processing around the church began as a ritual in order to show neighbors outside of your building that you were willing to do some of the things they thought was sacred in your sacred space. And so it was originally an evangelism tool, with not to annoy people, but to like help people come to the space. I think it's fun to do the agitation part too, where people notice. One of my favorite Palm Sunday services happened at St. Aidan's Episcopal Church, where I was working on some innovative worship with them. And we processed with our palms, not around the outside of the building, because they had done that every year, and they do it with drums, and they chant the names of saints, and they do it in this really artistic way. They were very good at processing with palms, and walking around the church was not going to do anything new for their faith. So what we did is we went across the street to the Safeway, and we processed with our palms through the produce aisle, through the meat aisle, through the bread aisle, through the register aisle, and they sang like a song while they were going. I didn't pick the song. It just is what happened, because they all felt uncomfortable going through the supermarket with their palms. They were very comfortable across the street around the outside of their church, but super uncomfortable in the produce aisle, because it was real neighbors, and it was people that they weren't sure how they were going to embrace them. The full-time head pastor of that congregation actually stayed outside of the Safeway because they had a really good relationship with the manager, and they did all these community projects, and they thought maybe the Safeway manager would get really mad at them for having walked through with palms. And what we discovered is that there were people who were inside the Safeway who were like, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. I missed Palm Sunday. Can I have a palm? I didn't get to go to church today because I was busy working," and people from inside the church let go of their carts and started following us as we walked around the church. And they might have been the ones who came up with the song to sing. And so it ended up being this really beautiful experience. And everyone who had gone inside of the supermarket had transformed from a space of fear to a space of joy and celebration, which is probably what it felt like. Particularly in Mark's gospel, which is the reading that many of us will do for this year. In Mark's version of the story, it doesn't necessarily specify that it's palm leaves, but other texts do, but just that they had branches and they set them down. In Mark's gospel, Jesus doesn't declare that he is the king of the Jews, which is what he'll be tried for later. But this visual of Jesus entering the city of Jerusalem in the way that a king would enter, he does it a bit more humble because he uses a donkey or a colt instead of a fancy chariot. And it's thought that he actually did his march at the exact same time as the real king of the Jews would have done the march from the other end of Jerusalem through a very fancy gate. And so he's doing it backwards, what was happening that day. And who knows if it actually irritated the Roman leaders of the day, but it seems like the fact that he had this parade and looked like a king of the Jew was something that pissed them off, because they later are going to beat him and dress him up in robes and put a thorny crown on his head. And you don't just go to the woven thorny crown store. Somebody's got to take some time and go get some thorns and weave it together. And so this is an agitation moment where it must have gotten under the skin of the people who were going to beat him up later. And so It's a very interesting procession.
One very kind of revelatory reading I did was The Last Week by Dominic Crossan, which I had never made that connection, and it makes so much sense. It also, for me, sort of changed my Christology about what was Christ about in those last times. It wasn't just that he was showing people how to love and doing all those things that he did, but he was. It seems like there was some intentional agitation of the powers that be, and a lot of that stuff kind of makes sense to me when you put it in that context. It doesn't say that in the text, but we know historically that the Pilate, the Roman governor, wasn't in Jerusalem. He was in Caesarea by the sea most of the year, except for during Passover, when they went up to Jerusalem, because they were more concerned about the people rising up, because during Passover they're celebrating, they're talking about their time of captivity, and rising up against the Egyptians and rising up against the Babylonians, and they're talking about their periods of captivity during Passover. So the Romans, I think, smartly said, well, this is the time we need to be most careful about them rising up against the Romans. Let's bring a show of force into Jerusalem,
Right.
to sort of make sure that doesn't happen. And so if you put that in the same context, whether or not it happened at the same time, it almost makes sense that it would, that Jesus riding in on a donkey in humility was what it was about. Meaning, it was about showing a different sort of power, but it was also mocking in a certain way, mocking the government. And so for me, that's why it sort of changes my own understanding of Christ, because if you follow the text, other than in John, if you follow the text, he does this, which sort of mocks the Romans, and the next thing he does is goes into the temple and overthrows the money changer tables. Mm-hmm. So while the government has come in to take residence for a week, it sets up this sort of intentional martyrdom of the end of the week. I think Jesus was trying to push buttons,
right?
And I think that's a good thing. I mean, it's not just that he died for our sins, but it wouldn't have happened if he hadn't pushed the buttons of power. And I think a lot of what he was saying this was more between the lines than a lot of other things, but he was talking about a reordering of power. And sometimes he was upfront about that, but most of the times it was in his actions or in the way or who he was talking to and how he was talking to people that sort of flipped this idea of power upside down. But Holy Week totally does that, right? So
the readings, the Mark reading for this Sunday, if you end up doing the Passion reading, is all of chapter 14 of Mark and all of chapter 15 of Mark. We can go into this a little bit more depth next week when we talk more about like what's going to happen in Holy Week. But for those who are going to read that version, I wanted to give you kind of a quick rundown of what in Mark is kind of interesting in these two chapters of the story. Because a lot of the movies that will show about the Passion of Jesus will mix together all of the different Gospels, and it's hard to remember which ones are in which account. So the beginning of chapter 14 is talking about the Passover and this fear that there's going to be a riot, that the political and religious leaders are having that kind of conversation. And then it starts with the anointing of Jesus' feet, which is what ends up being celebrated on Maundy, Thursday, this washing of feet. Interesting in the Greek is this idea about how excessively expensive it's this oil is, and how utterly the woman washing Jesus' feet has destroyed the alabaster jar that the oil is in, meaning you couldn't even recycle it and add more oil to it. So it's like, not only did the oil cost an excessive amount of money, but she shattered the fancy jar that it was in, so you could never like use it on anyone else. And so Jesus has this conversation about like, I'm here right now, sink into my time, sink into God's time in the world. Then immediately following that, you have this very excessive gesture of a lot of money being used to care for Jesus, and then a teeny tiny amount of money, a few silver pieces, being what betrays Jesus, right? And so this comparison that often happens in the gospel text, where a person who is vulnerable or who is a minority does the right thing when a disciple does the wrong thing and doesn't get it. So there's a very quick thing about Judas Iscariot selling out Jesus for a tiny amount of money. Then Jesus instructs them to buy or to go and get this, to go to the house where they're going to have the Last Supper. And the interesting thing about this part where Jesus says to have the Last Supper is he tells them exactly which of the one house in this giant city of Jerusalem he's going to meet them in. And the way that he does it is by describing it. He says, go to the city and you will meet a man carrying a pitcher of water. Now, either Jesus is psychic and he knows where everyone's going to be walking and what they're going to be doing, or this man who's carrying a pitcher of water is unique and there's only one that you could find. So in Jesus's day, men don't carry pitchers of water. Only women carry pitchers of water. And so this is the reason they're able to find the place where the Last Supper is going to take place, is because go find the man so well known for doing women's work that you cannot mistake him. His house is already ready. So Jesus has already been to this house before, and he knows that this special room is going to be perfect for them. So that's a fun little interesting tidbit that occurs in Mark's gospel. It's like, particularly if you're looking for trans-friendly texts, this person who transgresses gender boundaries hosts the Last Supper for Jesus. So then Jesus's learners kind of go set up this Passover meal. They're laying down at the table. Jesus says, one of you is going to betray me. And then what's interesting is that each of them say the words, not I, which normally I didn't put much thought in. I just thought it was like when little kids are like, not me, not me, not me. But not I is the opposite of the word that is proclaimed by Jesus during his trial when he says, I am, right? And I am are the words of God that comes through the burning bush that speaks to Moses. And so godly ways of saying is to say, I am this verb that's happening in the world. But the disciples are the opposite of that verb, not I, not I. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The next thing that happens is that Jesus does, big hands, Michelangelo painting, Last Supper, take and eat. The interesting thing in the Gospel of Mark about how the Last Supper occurs is Jesus never drinks the wine. He gives everyone the bread and says, eat it, as he hands it out. Then Jesus waits after people have already drunk the wine and says, this is my blood, right? So in this text, there could be an argument that Jesus is a particular type of Jewish person who chooses not to drink wine, that he's an Essene, and that so he neither tells people to drink wine who don't drink wine, nor does he drink the wine explicitly himself. So this could be the version that's like where Jesus lets you make your own choices in communion. So if someone needs to choose the gluten-free, they could choose their gluten-free. But it's not a bossy Jesus who was like, you must drink the wine, which is kind of nice for contemporary folk. Then Peter stumbles, and Jesus tells Simon Peter, that he's going to deny Jesus when the rooster crows 2 times. And this is significant. It's not like a random because it's going to be the morning and you're going to hear the rooster call and there were lots of roosters. It's because the rooster during that time in Jerusalem was a sign of a need for forgiveness, right? So any sort of haughtiness or sense of we know better than everyone else because we're the disciples and we were the closest to him. If you're a Lutheran and you believe everyone's equal in their sinfulness and in their forgiveness, like no one's better than anyone else in the eyes of God, then this cock crowing is that in this story. So the rooster is the sign that the disciples too are in need of God's forgiveness, that they're equally in need of all of this saving that Jesus was up to in the world. And so I kind of like that as a symbol that happens in this story. Then they go to Gethsemane. Jesus says, sit here while I pray. One of the things that is interesting for me in the Gethsemane reading is that the same description of how much oil was used to anoint Jesus's feet is the same adjective used for how sad Jesus is that he has to die, right? So he is grieved and excessively sorrowful. So it's not just that he was like annoyed or he was like praying in this like, if you can take this away, like this is not a Jesus who's like, yay, I'm going to die. He's excessively sorrowful that he's going to be captured and that he's going to be put on the cross. He then asks for God to take the cup away from him, to not have to do this. He finds everyone sleeping. He asks them to pray again. He finds them sleeping. And then what's interesting at the end of him finding them sleeping is that in verse 41 of chapter 14, the third time, I always had heard this story in my brain where it said, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake. In verse 41 of Mark's version, the third time Jesus sees them sleeping, his answer is, continue sleeping. It is enough. It is finished, right? And so I think that's kind of a fun thing that happens, is Jesus kind of stops trying to get them to do something that's counter to their nature. So then Judas kisses him. They pick him up, and the sword cuts off an ear, which is a fun part of the story if you're little. Then a dude runs away naked, which doesn't happen in the other stories. There's a guy who's just hanging out in a sheet. There was a previous parable that said, if you love me, go sell all of your things. So it's possible that this person is someone who had sold all of their things and they're just hanging out in a sheet. A soldier grabs their sheet. They run away naked, fleeing everything that was happening. So this is a death story that has a naked guy too. It's also a story at the end when Jesus resurrects. There's a guy like in a sheet who is the first one at the tomb. So maybe it's that same faithful guy who sold all his stuff. We don't know. So there's a naked guy, and then Peter follows from a very, very great distance, and it's explicitly stated that the priests use false evidence against Jesus, and that they contradict themselves when they're testifying. So one person says one thing, another person says another thing, and apparently everyone wants to call and ring my doorbell when I'm talking about Jesus dying. That's pretty funny. But so, and the description of how Jesus is during the trial is not just calm, cool, and collected, but it's calm and quiet like water that doesn't ripple when a rock's thrown in it, which is kind of, I wish I was that Zen in my regular life, not just when I'm put on trial. And then so Jesus answers that opposite of not I, and Jesus replies in verse 62, I am, right? Then the priests violently tear their clothes. They're so mad that Jesus said these words, not I. Peter betrays Jesus when the cock crows. There's an intuition happening that Peter is one of these people. He does the denial. And then chapter 15 basically is like the shortest death story you could possibly have. It only even is 3 pages, even when I insert pictures, it's so short. Jesus dies so quickly they have to poke him with a stick to see if he's really dead. And when he passes away, when they ask if they can bury him, Pilate is like, what do you mean he's already dead? That's crazy. It doesn't make any sense. But Jesus screams out with a loud voice, mirroring that beginning of the Gospel of Mark, where it says, behold, in the wilderness, screaming in a loud voice, I'll say, prepare the way of the kingdom of God. And so, good times. So then he dies, and he's taken down, and he's put in the tomb. Right? And then as Dan says, you got to wait and hear the rest of the story when the rest of the story is about to happen. But hopefully that didn't get boring because it was super long, but it's a super long reading. A lot of congregations probably choose to just read a couple chapters of that and maybe not the full story in order. But it's an interesting read to kind of understand what happens specifically in the Gospel of Mark. I talked a long time. What do you think, Dan?
I think it's important, even because otherwise you still get, unless you're at every service, you still get the story kind of piecemeal, and it's kind of nice for once, literally the only time in the whole year that we hear the whole story. You may, half the time when I preach, I'm saying, well, what happens right before this gospel is this, and what happens right after this gospel is this.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important, because you have to sort of contextualize it, put it in the part of the story where it is. And I think that usually helps with them understanding, what's going on. You don't have to do this with this because it's a long story, but I even though it takes a little while, what I do is I take some other things out of the service and I abbreviate my sermon, because I think it's good to hear that whole thing at least once in a while. Even if you go to the Thursday and Friday, it's pieces of that. It's still not the whole thing. So it's good to hear it all at once, just for our own, to put it all together. But that's the text. We also have other texts this week, and as if it was a regular Sunday, which it kind of
I know.
is.
I don't know how people fit all of those texts in there, but God bless it.
I already heard before we started recording that you don't like the Philippians text, and I kind of do. So that's exciting.
Ooh.
I like when we disagree on text.
Well, so here's why I don't like the Philippians text. The Philippians text is a text that was used to convince people living in slavery in the United States that they should remain in slavery and that they should be nice to their slave masters no matter how they treated them. And because it's a verse that talks about, well, Jesus, even though he was equal to God, he took on the form of a slave, and being a slave is such a noble profession. And so my dislike for the Philippians text is based on how it has been used in American history. And we can't have American history not happen. I'm sure it was a lovely text prior to that. I love the idea of Jesus not being haughty and not holding things over our head. And I like the idea of Jesus helping the vulnerable. I just think because it's been used to tell people to stay slaves, it's kind of always going to make me want to throw up in my mouth. But
I get that. I think it ties really well to that, what I talked about earlier about this sort of different type of power too. Because I really also believe, after saying what I said earlier, that the disciples down to the very end assumed that Jesus was going to lead some kind of an uprising, that Jesus was going to, lead the people in revolt over the Romans and kick the Romans out and restructure everything. And Jesus did that, just not the way that they wanted to. And so I think this Philippians text sort of hints at that a little bit, that there's different kinds of power, and Jesus maybe could have driven the people into some sort of uprising, but he knew that being humble and giving himself up would have more power in the long run. And it did. There's no Roman Empire anymore. So
do that. No, go ahead.
I get that the part about the slave. I will say, even as a pastor, I do sometimes even personally struggle with what the cross was all about. And that it's not. In fact, when I first went into seminary, I had a long conversation with my pastor at the time, saying, "Well, I think I'm." This was before I started seminary. I said, "I think I want to go to seminary, but I'm not sure I'm Lutheran. Maybe I should go to seminary to be some other denomination." And he said, "Well, why?" And I said, "Because there's a lot of little reasons, but basically the primary reason is I'm not really into the sacrificial atonement, which for people watching has to do with this the Jesus died for our sins language, which I believe, but not quite the way that it's usually talked about in churches personally." And he said, and this is a revelation for me, that there's at least 7 or 8 different sort of theories on what the cross was about, even within the Lutheran Church. And so I said, "Oh, good." Not to say that the cross itself and the crucifixion wasn't important, but I don't. This is me personally, and maybe this is something that can be up for debate even among pastors. But that literal dying for my sins, it feels like there's a step missing for me personally. So
the way I describe it, the way I've described it in my time as a pastor is, like, to put it this way, if I had a say in it, I wouldn't have chosen death on a cross as a way to like connect with humans and the way to love me. I didn't get a choice. It happened a long time ago. And I'm grateful that I get to benefit from it, even if I would have voted against it. Right. And so
Right.
I trust and I believe that like God's ability to save me happens because God promised to save me. Would I have chosen different methods? Yes. And how do we model being people who benefit from something even when it wasn't our choice? And I think we live in a really great time in society to have those conversations. Like, how do I benefit from privilege that I didn't choose to take on for myself because of the color of my skin? And what's my response now? And I think those are all really interesting kinds of conversations. One of the answers comes in our scripture reading, Psalm 31. If you are someone who always thinks that the way to like have faith in God and the way to love God is to always feel optimistic and celebratory and be like, God, I love you so much. This cancer made me learn so many lessons. If you think that that's the only way to have faith, then Psalm 31 might be for you, because Psalm 31 is depressing and written by a depressed person. It's there, like verse 10 talks about my life is wasted with grief and my years, like I'm failing with affliction. I am like the dead and forgotten. I am as useless as a broken pot, right? So I love this idea that all different types of faith can be represented. You don't have to be confident in your faith to be a faithful person. And Psalm 31 gives us that room we need to like be like, I don't know, this doesn't work with me. I'm going to wrestle with my idea of death on a cross and what that means. And so I kind of like Psalm 31.
And for me, that makes more sense to me, that the cross clearly means something, but it's more about that God can sacrifice themselves on the cross means that in the worst of times, for me personally, God can be there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably a little bit of an oversimplification of another kind of atonement theory, but that accompaniment that happens, I think it happened already, but it's more personal because of the death on the cross.
Yeah.
Because that way the God is with us, celebrating us when we have joys and comforting us, and with us hand in hand when we have sorrows in our lives. And that's because of the cross.
Yeah.
That makes more sense to me personally.
And the Isaiah reading provides the exact opposite feeling from the Psalm. The Isaiah reading is about being confident. It's about being certain, being as certain as stone. Like, I am so into doing this that I'm going to be so steadfast that I'm like flint, right? I have no shame. I'm going to follow you. I've got this all figured out. And not all parts of the book of Isaiah are like that. There are other parts of the book of Isaiah that are like, woe to you, hurry up and bring justice. But this section of Isaiah is interesting in how exactly opposite it is from the Psalm reading. So it's if you want to have a kind of conversation with your congregation about, there's lots of different feelings you can have about what's happening during this time of year, the Isaiah and the Psalm readings can help with that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Those are my thoughts.
I don't have many other thoughts either. I really like, I mean, this is going to sound like a really church nerdy thing to say. I really love Holy Week. And I love Palm Sunday, and I love it. So I don't normally do this, but I will tell you where my sermon is leading this week, because I'm kind of, it's sort of interesting, like it's gone to a place that I haven't gone before. I've preached sort of on some of that rebellious Jesus kind of stuff in the past, and so. But this year I thought about the word procession, Palm Sunday procession, and what words that's based off of. Process. That the process. I see Lent as a process of growth, a process of understanding each other and understanding God better. Procession also means not just moving through something like literally Jesus, the crowd, they were moving into Jerusalem, but a procession in terms of personal growth too. So a progression rather than procession. All these words are sort of connected, and so I like the idea of thinking as Holy Week as a more compressed version of what we've already been doing in Lent. That we start with this literally. We start with Holy Week with a procession.
Yeah,
and we end with the resurrection and Easter, and that's the finish line with the checkered flag. And in between, there's this process, and going through it all, I think, is really beneficial if we're sincere about it and we really spend some time. That's why I really love Lenten devotionals. I wrote one this year, but I like that it's a time to sort of set aside and process through our own feelings, our own growth, and come out the other side maybe a little different in a positive way, or maybe exactly the same, but it gives us a chance to figure things out, and that it's not just that I like Holy Week because I'm a pastor and I'm a nerd and I'll be at church a lot, but it's kind of interesting to sort of personally figure things out, who I am personally, and find a way to get, as we're processing through the story of the Passion through the week, we're processing through our own feelings, and because of the readings, because of the way Holy Week works, you start on this high, you sort of dip down to this uncertainty. I wouldn't even say depression, but uncertainty, and then you come back out into a high. So it's designed for us to process, to process our feelings, to process our growth. And I think, you cannot go to those midweek services and nobody's going to criticize you, but you're shortchanging yourself, really, in the long run, more than anybody else. So, and that's all I have to say about that. So I'm going to preach about procession, and because we're reading the Passion and it's really long, it's just going to be a 5-minute homily on what does this word procession and process mean, and why is it important right now? There we go.
Well,
if you remember my conversation and you're watching this, you don't need to come Sunday because you already know what the sermon's going to be about.
There you go. I was going to say, I'm rooting for everybody at home, everybody who's made it this far through the Bible study. Good job, and blessings on your progressing throughout this next week and through Holy Week. And I hope you take good care of yourselves and that you love more, and everything else less. Just love more. Anyway, take care, everybody.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.